So hello everyone, welcome to today's IEP Live Learn Lunch. We're really excited today to be joined by Mike from Meraki Consult, and he will be talking to us about best practice and how to deal with complaints effective. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Mike, who's going to take us through today's session. And while he's just sharing his slides and getting ready to get started, it will be an interactive session and we will be using the chat facility. So we will be asking you some questions. So please do get your fingers ready and do feel free to share thoughts and comments throughout the session via the chat. And I will make sure that all of those thoughts and comments are shared with Mike throughout the session. I've just seen a lovely message come up in the chat from Martin about how my move went. It went wonderfully, Martin, and thank you for coming back for another session. So we'll look forward to the session today, and I'll look forward to speaking to you all at the end.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can see my screen. I can see a few nods. Excellent, that's brilliant. So I'm going to be talking about how to handle participant complaints and feedback. Just a little bit about myself and Meraki. Just apologise that I didn't do this slide. I don't tend to do lots and lots of words, but there are some slides of words on. So Meraki is disguised itself as a boutique consulting firm. It's quite a new startup organisation set up by two ladies, Deborah Skyers and Sejal Patel, who both used to work with me at the charity, the Shaw Trust. And they saw a niche in the market for an opportunity to provide friendly support to organisations to enable them to deal with a range of issues, as you've got here, audits, assurance services, quality, risk management, that type of thing. So I won't bore you by reading the slide because I'm sure you can all read. I'm Mike Carne. My background actually is in risk management and quality assurance. I spent 16 years with Shaw Trust looking after internal audit and risk management, and latterly getting them through ISO 9001. It's interesting because people say, well, risk and quality, how do those two things go together? And my argument is actually they're two very closely related disciplines and relate very closely to what we're going to look at here today. Risk, if you like, helps us to avoid doing the wrong thing, and quality helps us to do the right thing better. And of course, with quality, what we want to do is to use feedback from the people we work with to make things better in our organisations and in the services we provide. So I'm going to use these concepts of risk management and quality management to explore how we can handle participant feedback and complaints in the most effective way. So first of all, question, and I'm going to open this up to everybody. What is feedback? I'll have to hide my screen so you can see you all. Any thoughts? You can either raise your hands, scream out, or whatever.
Yeah, we'll give them a moment to start popping that in the chat. I suspect that's one of those questions where we all know, but putting it into words is really tricky, isn't it?
Oh, it is, yes. And it's not a trick question either.
Okay, so I'm sure we'll see something pop up any moment. And as Martin has said, if anyone today would prefer to pop their hands up, we can mute and unmute you. And Darren is positive or negative constructive criticism. And Martin says comments to gain an insight of a product or service.
Excellent. And really what you've got there is that's brilliant. The response you get from customers and clients as well, perceptions of our performance, that's absolutely fantastic. Those are the sorts of things we're looking for. Let's just go back to the presentation. I hope this works. Here we go. There we are. This one here. That's what I want. Share. Back to it. Okay. There we go. Very interesting noise. So what is feedback? You're right. It's all of those things. It's comments in the form of letters, text, SMS. It's feedback. It's reviews. It's all sorts of things. It's really any way in which we interact with other people. And if you think about it, how do we collect it? It can be by request. We can ask for this feedback. It can be voluntary. Now, we think about complaints, that's always voluntary because the person making the complaint is volunteering to make that comment about our organisation and about ourselves. And really think about it, feedback does fall into those three categories. comments, observations about the experience the individuals had. They could include elements of complaint, perhaps niggles about things that need to be fixed. And the question perhaps we need to ask ourselves is, do we acknowledge those comments? Do we take them on board? Do we use those comments? And sometimes they're the most difficult ones to quantify, because, well, did that comment actually really have any substance? So to drill into those. But compliments, their compliments are brilliant. Now, when I worked for the Shaw Trust, I was looking after the complaints department, and to be perfectly honest, Shaw Trust didn't get many complaints. I'm guessing with you guys, similar sort of sector, you probably find you're getting more compliments but don't realise it. You go into someone's office and you find their cards, flowers, boxes of chocolates, really positive messages from people you've worked with and helped. They're compliments, and those are also dynamite, because within those compliments, little nuggets of this is what we did well. So one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is, do we celebrate those compliments? Do we think about, well, what was it we did well? How can we replicate that elsewhere? And of course, you mentioned the complaints, where things go wrong. And I put go wrong in my mind in inverted commas, because sometimes things maybe aren't quite as wrong as maybe the individual complaining thinks, or that we might think. Now, what I'm going to try and do with each of these slides as you go through is to try and bring out some thoughts about some learning, and also some thoughts that we can take away with us as well. And so perhaps the learning from this point is that a complaint is just another form of feedback. And so although we're focusing on complaints management, the principles that we're going to look at here, we can apply to any sort of feedback, be it comments or compliments as well. And perhaps just a takeaway to think about their own organizations is, what's our culture? Do we have a culture of regularly collecting and evaluating feedback? I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do. It's quite an easy throwaway comment, oh, get feedback and review it, that type of thing. It's not necessarily that easy to do, but it's a really important activity to undertake. So don't let anyone think that gathering feedback and making use of it is a wasted exercise. It's really important that you do that. And it's the little things that you pick up that make the biggest difference. So just a little takeaway just from this particular slide. So let's look at our next slide and just consider this for a moment. How do you view feedback? And this interesting question, and maybe we need to think about that as an individual and as an organization. So P.T. Barnum, there's no such thing as bad publicity. The Greatest Showman, he said, everything is good. I would say that actually that's probably not quite true, because too much bad publicity, teeth back in, really has a negative impact on reputation. But the point he makes is valid, that we need to listen to everything that's said about us. But what we don't want to do is fall into the trap that Winston Churchill mentions about throwing stones at every dog that barks, because to try and avoid feedback, particularly when it's bad news, to try and perhaps have a culture which buries bad news, or even worse, responds negatively to that, in other words, picking a fight, actually stops us getting to a final destination. It stops us improving our services, and it stops us actually improving as an organization. Ultimately, it wastes time and it's damaging. Again, we need to perhaps think to ourselves about the learning. So the learning here is that all feedback is useful, even the bad stuff. But again, the takeaway for our own organizations and ourselves is how do we respond to that feedback? How do we respond to negative feedback in particular? And it really is a good barometer to ourselves to test that. Perhaps ask other people, how do I respond? If a participant comes to me and has a good old moan, how do I respond? Do my hackles go up? Do I get aggressive? Do I even cower in fear? If something comes in writing, how do I respond to that? Again, think about our own organizations. Are our organizations learning organizations? Do we actually want to learn as an organization to make things better? It's so important. So the purpose of today's webinar, we're going to focus on grievances and complaints. So if we think about it, as already said, we're getting 3 for the price of 1 here, because the principles apply to both compliments and comments as well. We're going to look at how we treat participants fairly, how to make sure that we don't perhaps give them the wrong messages or take on too much ourselves. It's trying to get that balance there. finding a process to investigate complaints and feedback, how to resolve them. We've also look at briefly the role of the independent case examiner, or ICE, as he's often known, and just the points of learning that we can take away from this webinar. Trying to use two devices here, so well, mouse and a trackpad, so apologies if I go whoops every now and then. So let's look at a complaint. What actually is a complaint? If you break it down, you could end up with a person that comes to you having a rant and a rave. You can have a mile-long email, text messages coming out of your ears. But ultimately, all complaints boil down to is that expression: you didn't give me what I wanted. Now, if you think about that, what is it that an individual might want from us? Well, an individual might want something from us. They might want something to do something. They might want some information, or they want access to somebody. I don't know about you, but the one my pet hate is you phone your bank or your insurance company and you get this automated message. Not just the one that says we're very busy and and please hold for the next 5 minutes, but it's the machine speak that asks you things, and what you want to do is ask a really simple question that can generate a complaint. Also, attitudes, and attitudes is probably the key one. That it doesn't take much to really rub someone up the wrong way and to generate therefore a complaint. I did a little survey on Google. I'm just going to move my device here so I can see it better. Some of the most common complaints: not keeping promises. Yes, I'll get that out to you tomorrow. I'll phone you back in an hour's time. Nothing. Poor customer service. Do you know 78% of consumers end a business relationship because of poor customer service? I know many cases as the customers are dealing with, and we'll come to the definition of customer in a moment, haven't necessarily got a choice, but certainly it can switch them off if they have poor service. Hanging around, waiting, rude staff, individuals not listening, information not being available or not being available in the right form, and then the quality of service or the cost of the service. What sort of complaints do we get? We tend to get 4 different types. Aggressive complainants. Now, these are the ones who they want to have a good old rant. They display emotion. They're not so much interested in getting a solution. They just want to have a good old scream and shout. It's the type of customer you find in the restaurant. My soup is cold, it's a disgrace. And they scream and shout and walk out of the restaurant. Then you get the other type, the expressive type. And these are somewhat dangerous because they will talk to other people, often use social media to vent their concerns. Avoid this restaurant, they serve cold soup. So what can you do about it? You find out through the back door. And the passive ones, very similar. They're going to complain to everybody except you. And then you get the constructive ones whose complaints seem very mild, but they're actually organized. They're critical perfectionists, potentially sarcastic. And they're going to want a precise solution and compensation for their trouble as well. And there's a mix of people within this, and no doubt you guys have probably experienced this sort of feedback from individuals. How do you deal with them? Well, sometimes it's a case of just taking a step back and listening. I deliberately use a pointed finger with this slide because, as we all know, when you point the finger, there's 3 more pointing back at yourself. And it might be that the complainant is a person themselves at fault because they don't know what they want. They perhaps have too great an expectation. Or they don't know what it is to ask for or who to ask for. They haven't asked the right question. Or maybe they've misunderstood or misread something. And I was saying to Helen earlier on, it's a real problem with written communication because written communication is quite factual and quite soulless. And sometimes the intent of written communication is missed because it is written. But you can also turn the finger around the other way as well. What about our response to a complaint? Well, I don't like your tone. I don't like your attitude, you say to the complainant. Or, how stupid. We need to think of the fingers pointing back to ourselves. We live and breathe systems and processes that we know. It's obvious to us what we should do, but it may not be obvious to somebody else. We know our people. We see them, speak to them every day, and the customer doesn't. No, of course, Fred's not going to be rude because I know Fred, I know Dave, I know Jane, but actually the individual making the complaint doesn't. They didn't necessarily understand their idiosyncrasies, perhaps the stresses and strains they're under, and why they got upset. And also, we don't know the complainant, do we? We don't know what's going on in their life. So sometimes if we perhaps respond inappropriately, think of the three fingers pointing back at ourselves. And this is an important point here, a question to yourselves. Actually, I do it without screen sharing. Who is our customer? So we talk about customer complaints, but who is the customer? I'll let you think about that one. I might have to unshare my screen unless you want to shout out, Helen.
I can shout out for you, not a problem. Just waiting for everyone to have time to pop that in the chat and let us know what they think. Everyone, Michelle says, everyone we work with is a customer, says Martin. Dahlia says, anyone who expects a service from us. And Darren says, internal is staff, colleagues, as well as suppliers, external, etc.
You guys are all stars. Excellent. That's brilliant. When I was working with Shaw Trust, one of the biggest problems that we had was the identification of customers. And there was one customer that we missed out every time. You're right. We spoke about people using our services. We spoke about suppliers. We spoke about staff and volunteers. We have volunteers with Shaw Trust. But there's one person that we missed out. Who might that be? You've not mentioned it yet.
I think there's some head scratching going on. Darren said Alf.
Elf.
Giles said ourselves.
Ourselves, yeah, okay.
Our employer, Julie says.
Our employer. Getting close with our employer. Just take that by extension. Let me try and help. If you go to a shop and you buy something, are you a customer? Yes, you are. What do you do when you buy something?
That's a good question. You've got me thinking now, Mike. What do I do? Something I'm happy usually, and then I have to try and justify why I've spent all that money to my other half. Dahlia says colleagues, and Robert has asked whether it's our company. Who are the other customers?
Okay.
Michelle said products.
Say again.
Michelle has said products.
Products.
Martin said, what was the question again? So that customer that we haven't identified yet when we were talking about the different types of customers. So we sort of mentioned quite a lot of the key stakeholders within the process, but perhaps we've missed an important one there.
We have.
You may have to tell us, Mike.
Okay, all right. If you think about it, if we run commission services or we are delivering services on behalf of the DWP, they're the customer. They're paying us the money. And they're obviously, or normally, if I'm a Shaw Trust, the one stakeholder that everyone forgets about, the person who pays us the money. But actually, if you go into a shop and you pay money to the shop, you're the customer, aren't you? And this is really important because we need to understand what our commissioners' requirements are as well. We need to understand what those people who are paying for our services require for us. And we also would expect to receive feedback from them. It might include complaints. But you are right, everyone that we provide services for, everyone we interact with, they are a customer. I'm really pleased that suppliers are mentioned as well. But also don't forget the general public. Anybody that our organisation interacts with or touches is in effect a customer because they are affected by what we do. So although we speak about customer complaints, probably ought to think about stakeholder complaints, those who have an interest, be it even an occasional interest in the organisation. They have a right to make comments or complaints about our organisation. Because here's where risk comes in. If we don't know who our customer is, how can we meet their needs? If we can't meet their needs, then we face a massive reputational risk. And as an organisation, we can't learn and grow and meet the needs and requirements of our customers. So here's the learning. everyone has a right to complain, to feedback about the services they receive or the services they think they receive, and the way we provide those services. So again, the takeaway, I'll just move my laptop again. Do we and our organisation fully understand who our customers are and what their needs and expectations are? Is that information clearly communicated both to them and within our organisations? Because it's so important that we understand who we're doing work for. So we think about that. You didn't give me what I wanted is the crux of a complaint. How are we now going to respond to that complaint? Let's look at our next slide. So how do we treat a complainant fairly? And I've got a big ear here, and I could put a big I as well, because often we receive complaints and feedback in the form of written text as well as verbally. But I do know, I used to work with a lady called Maria. Maria's brilliant, and she would get complainants on the phone, and she'd have to sit there listening patiently while a person poured out their heart, she was trying to listen to what they're saying, understand what they're coming from, where they're coming from. Now, she was brilliant. She actually now does some work for the Samaritans, so that's how good she was. But let's look at some of the do's and don'ts about taking or handling complaints. Let's think about some of the don'ts. But first of all, first don't is don't make assumptions. Now, it's very easy when we are receiving information from a person and perhaps they're going around the houses because they don't really fully understand maybe what they're complaining about or the issue they have. What's the worst thing you can do? Yes, I know. So you're saying, and oh, I can fix that, and they haven't finished. Don't make assumptions about the individual. Don't make assumptions even about their age, their sex, their sexuality, or anything like that. Make no assumptions at all about the individual. The other thing not to do is to acquiesce. What do we mean by that? And again, I'll speak from personal experience from Assured Trust. One of the biggest issues we had with Assured Trust was an individual, and it's so easy to do. A person comes to the organisation very, very angry, very upset, and immediately say, yes, I'm very sorry, it's all our fault. Because what happens then? Well, as I got in the type at the bottom, the customer isn't always right. If we say, yeah, it's all our fault, they may have to go back on our word and say, actually, no, partly it's your fault, or you've misunderstood. So never, ever acquiesce. You could say, well, I'm sorry you feel that way. How can I help you? That's a more positive way. What's the worst thing to do? Argue. Remember pointing the finger. Well, it's all your fault. You misunderstood. You don't know how things are. It's very, very difficult working here, and you're wrong. Arguing is bad. Blaming too. Oh yes, it's that department. They're not very good. Or well, it's not my fault. That's just going to get person's back up, isn't it? Or make excuses. You know. Oh yes, I think actually. Was it rail track? You know, leaves on the line, on the wrong types of leaves on the line. An excuse for trains not running to time. It might have been a real reason, but the way it was portrayed was as an excuse. And there's a difference between explaining the facts and making the excuse. It's called evidence, isn't it? So don't make an excuse for something that doesn't need to be excused. Another issue we have, particularly when we're confronted by someone who's really crossed, upset, is to overpromise. Yeah, I'll sort this out straight away. It'll be sorted in the next hour. Or I'll phone you back this time tomorrow. And we've all had it, haven't we? We have the promise that we're going to get a call back, and it never happens. So the worst thing we can do is to overpromise, because all it's going to do is compound the issue and make it worse. So what do we do? What do we need to do instead? What's going to do it? Well, first of all, try to understand and empathise. And sometimes it's difficult. Again, if you're dealing with an individual perhaps who has a disability and we don't have that disability, it's difficult to empathise, but we try. Certainly we try to understand. The worst thing to say is, yes, I know how you feel, because honestly, we don't necessarily know how the individual feels. What is important to do, though, is to own the complaint. Take some ownership and say, yeah, I will take this on. I'll try and understand what you're talking about or what you're saying to me, and I will come back to you in a reasonable time to get some resolution for you. Don't be frightened to ask for clarity. You probably could come back to me because I come from the West Country, and if I haven't gone OR yet, then I might do. And you might think, what are you saying? I don't understand. And it could be because of accent, language. It could be because the person simply doesn't understand, can't articulate. So there's no harm going back just to check. And also to be realistic in your expectations of the individual, the expectations of yourself, and the expectations of your organization too. So don't make promises that simply can't be fulfilled. What you can do is say, okay, I've taken your complaint, I've logged it, so we'll come back to logging in a few moments, and I'm going to try and do something about it. But don't make promises you can't be kept, because by being realistic, ask for clarity, own the complaint, we do that next thing, we inspire confidence. The individual may just wanted to offload, and at the heart of their complaint is something quite minor. But we've inspired confidence. Alternatively, it could be something really, really massive. But because we've responded in an appropriate way, they now believe that we're going to help them. Whether we can help them or not is another thing. And that's where the trick of finding someone who can help comes in. But certainly we're now that link between the individual and the organisation. And we want to help them feel good that they've come forward, made the complaint, and they feel confident that something's going to be done, they're being taken seriously. The important thing too is maintaining confidentiality. I'll go back to Maria again, bless her. Maria had quite a loud voice, and sometimes you could hear across an open plan office, across the other side of the office, explaining to someone something's going on. We had to have a chat and said, Maria, you need to keep your voice down a little bit because we don't want everyone knowing what's going on. She was really good. But the important thing with maintaining confidentiality is obviously the individual's complaint is about their circumstances. It doesn't need to be shared with someone else. And I will tell you a little story that apparently was true, and this is overheard in an office. It's that nutter who complained last week, Neil on the phone this was, he's off on one again. What the individual explaining that to a colleague didn't realise is she'd forgotten to mute the phone call. And the individual making the complaint was, as you can understand, none too happy about that. But that's an extreme example. But there are some situations where actually we can't maintain confidentiality. For example, if you think about a safeguarding situation, child abuse, or where a crime's been committed, and it'd be quite right to explain to the individual that I need to share this with particular authorities because that's what I have to do. But perhaps the important thing to think about in terms of the do's on this side is imagine it's your granny who's on the end of the phone, or who's writing the email, who's doing the SMS to you, who really is upset and wants some help and direction. How would you feel if that was your granny coming to you or coming to a different organisation asking for help? And maybe it's a useful little touchstone just to think about that. So again, our points of learning, our initial response, what we say, how we say it, and even if we're looking at someone face-to-face in terms of body language, remember being in the office? That can have an impact, a massive impact on how the complaint is handled and how it's resolved. And think too, the last thing said is often the first thing remembered and then shared with others. The takeaway, does my organisation offer complaints handling training? Do we have a team or person who handles complaints? If we do, what can I learn from them? Remember, these points all apply to all forms of feedback, complaints, compliments and comments received in all forms. So we should treat everyone who comes back to us with feedback in these same ways, and certainly should own their feedback and inspire confidence and use that feedback to learn. So let's get to the crux of this. How do we actually manage then our complaints? How do you investigate and resolve complaints? Well, I said complaints handling is an exercise in risk management. We're trying to resolve something that's gone wrong. We're trying to manage the risk to our reputation, maybe a risk to our systems and processes, a risk to our personnel, even a risk to the complainant. Now, those of you who maybe had some experience of risk management know that to manage risk, you build in things called controls, mitigations, or measures that minimize or eliminate that risk. So how do we deal with the risk of complaints? Well, certainly a requirement of the Restart program is there has to be a formal complaints management process in place. So perhaps those who work in Restart, does your organisation have one? If you do you know what it is? So what were hallmarks of a good complaints management system? Well, certainly it would be clearly defined. we've clearly set out realistic timelines and as few escalation stages as possible. It would include elements of independent review and oversight. It would also enable learning through what we call root cause analysis. In other words, find out what really went wrong. Don't fix the symptom, fix the actual ailment itself. And importantly, to drive what we call corrective preventive action. And you'll notice in the top right-hand corner, we have this little cycle, the plan, do, check, act cycle, which is something that comes from the Quality Assurance Standard ISO 9001. We'll just discuss that in a moment as to what all that means. So have you got a process? Even something simple. I've jotted down on my notes here, it's like a 3-stage or 4-stage process. Stage 0 is when the complaint comes in, and often it's straight to the department. Now, if you're a front of house facing individual, you could be the person who receives perhaps the email, or the person who's really, really unhappy. So the question you've got to ask yourself is, do I keep proper records of the feedback that comes in? Do I share those records with the appropriate personnel? Have I been trained to handle that sort of feedback? It's important to get that right training. Interestingly, one of the biggest issues that we dealt with Sure Trust was a poor response at that stage 0. Because all that happened is the individual responding didn't respond in a particularly, say, articulate way, and that just added fuel to the fire. The complaint escalated. But let's say at that stage 0 we can't deal with the complaint. What can we do then? Then to move to a stage 1, perhaps moving that complaint to the independent complaints team. And all these stages, make sure that the complainants, they understand what's going on, that their complaint is acknowledged, not simply as a ping back, but proper acknowledgement, say, I've received this I believe is what you're saying, and we're going to investigate. And then allow the time to make the investigation and then to respond. And if that doesn't work, stage 2, perhaps taking that complaint to a member of senior management, again, with the investigation process and the acknowledgement as well. I think something is really important in all these stages, particularly if you have got people who are trained to handle complaints, is to keep those involved at all times. Now, if you're a front of house person and you're dealing with a complainant, don't feel frightened of picking up the phone or dropping an email to someone who is used to handling complaints. How do I deal with this? Ask the question. There's no shame in this, because whilst your expertise might be in dealing with front of house situations, it may not be in putting a letter together or an email together, or making any assumptions anywhere. But it's just important to play to your strengths and play to the strengths within your organisation. So I mentioned the plan, do, check, act model, which you use in the for ISO 9001. We're going to go through each stage of how we can actually manage a complaint effectively. And we start with the process called planning. There you go. And the plan bit, if you like, is the receipt of the complaint itself, because that, if you like, that's ground zero. And we already mentioned how we should respond and receive complaints in. Certainly, it's so important to acknowledge the complaint and the complainant. And importantly, to record exactly what the complainant is asking or is speaking about. And it's good to go back to them, check back to them to make sure you have understood properly. Because that's the basis of explaining to yourself and maybe to others when you carry out the investigation or hand the investigation over exactly what it is that's going on. So it's so important too that we explain those steps to the complainants. So again, this is ownership, isn't it? So we actually understand what they want and they understand what we're going to do for them. If you like, as a simple thing, this is getting our ducks in a row, isn't it? Receiving that complaint. What's the next stage? Well, it's the do bit, investigate. Now, it may not be us as individuals investigating. It could be that there's another team. It depends on how your organisation functions. But the investigation is so important to gather the facts behind the complaint and importantly, the context. So let's just say, for example, we have someone who's come into the office very, very upset because someone's been rude to them. And that was often a cause of complaint. And it could be the context is that we normally have 4 staff on board. 1 was on holiday, 2 are out sick, and there's 1 poor person who's trying to hold the fort, running around like a headless chicken, and they perhaps say something inappropriate. They perhaps are a bit dismissive of the individual, and it causes this complaint to come forward. The context is important because sometimes the context then needs to be explained to the complainant, maybe with an apology. Timeliness is also important. One of the issues that we faced in the past is that a complaint would come in, it came actually to the complaints department, and no one wanted to take it seriously. Well, it's the complaints department responsibility to sort it out, not ours. Well, actually, it's everyone's responsibility, and to sort the complaint out in a timely way. So it's important to stress, and this is going back into the organisation itself, senior management need to take some ownership of this to ensure that complaints handling is given priority. With the investigation too, there's also the escalation route. There may need to be a need to investigate, to escalate, should I say, an investigation. If you find you're getting pushback from perhaps a supervisor, a manager, whatever else, or an individual, you may need to escalate and actually go over their head. That's not a bad thing, because it gets the complaint resolved. And all the way through, to keep checking your facts, to keep making sure you're actually dealing and addressing the issues that are raised. And again, record it. Record everything that goes on during the investigation. Probably, I would say in the minutest detail, but almost you need to do that, because we don't know how the investigation is going to turn out and where it may lead. The next stage is response, and that's I call check. And this is actually really the response, and the checking is actually the complainant themselves checking what we've said. So is our response to the complainant is accurate? Is it clear? Is it non-emotive? And that's so important in two respects. One is we're going to fall on our sword and apologise profusely for the things we should and shouldn't have done. And actually that's nothing to do with the complaint. Or conversely, we might say, well, actually it's all your fault because you didn't understand our systems. Well, that's not an appropriate response either. So we need here then in our response to identify the responsibilities that lie with each party. What are our responsibilities? What are the complainant's responsibilities? What are the next steps? And that goes into the action section. What actions are going to be taken? What actions does the complainant need to take? What actions might we need to take, perhaps to put right something that's gone wrong? And all that should go into that response, because that, again, that inspires confidence in the complainant. They've been taken seriously. And actually too, for ourselves as an organisation, we've got a record of something we're going to do to make things better. And that really takes us to our final one, which is to act. Now, I'm just going to hide that better, because we've got the follow-up. So what's the follow-up all about? Well, let's say something has gone wrong. Well, let's confirm that we understand as an organisation what's gone wrong. What are we going to do to remediate? What are we going to do to put it right for the complainants? What are we going to do to put it right for organisation? And then what are we going to do to implement that corrective action? And we're like checking to make sure that corrective action has actually been put into place, that it works. And there's also a reporting line too. So back with Shaw Trust, one of the things we did every quarter was report to the audit committee. All the complaints that come in, their status, what's happened to them, obviously depersonalised. But it was important to do that to give the audit committee some assurance as to what had happened. Indeed, one of the things we used to do, and it might be worth something to think about with your own organisation, is you have internal audits, is to sometimes pass those complaints back to, or the remediations back to internal audits, particularly when you've changed systems and processes, so the internal auditor can check to make sure that those changes have taken effect and they are doing what they're supposed to do. And two, we may need to escalate, we may need to take the matters to a third party. That's where we just think about having reports in confidence, maybe need to share elsewhere. But that's how the plan do check act cycle works if you're looking at complaints management. Because by doing that, then we make sure that we use complaints as a way of improving our services. But remember too, it's not just complaints, it applies to compliments and feedback as well. So get our ducks in a row, leave no stone unturned in terms of investigation, measure twice, cut once, as my dad used to say when I was trying to sort out pieces of wood, and we respond to make sure it's right. And in terms of follow-up, say what you do and do what you say. So what's the learning? To make sure we have a fully, clearly defined process for complaints handling, to record everything, to investigate everything, to communicate clearly and make sure things are put right. And if you can't do it yourself, ask for help. Takeaway, Well, do you know what the complaints process or complaints handling process is in your organisation? Does it work? Is it fit for purpose? Perhaps at your next team meeting, perhaps review that with your colleagues. Even invite complaints handling personnel to attend that meeting. Review that with them to make sure that it works. That was quite a long little session. I was wondering if anyone had any sort of questions so far on that element. I'll just unshare my screen, just see if there's anything cropping up, any thoughts.
Not at the moment. Darren says all good.
Excellent. Thank you, Darren.
Yeah, Mike, when you're giving them lots of good information, they go quiet as they make notes.
Right. Okay. So if I take all good as being all good, because I'm conscious of time as well, because we don't want anyone going absolutely hungry for their lunchtime. So what I'll do, I'll just press on to the next. Oh, great to see a workable structure.
Dahlia said, yeah, workable structure. Yeah.
Excellent. Right, let's go back to the presentation, because let's go into look for a moment at one thing. There it is. For some reason, I have many screens open on this computer. I don't know why. So, okay. Next, we're going to look at very, very quickly is ICE. I hope my machine has decided not to do anything. Come on. There we go. The independent case examiner, ICE. I get a few words in this one because I copied and pasted off of the website with this one. ICE describes themselves as an impartial referee for people who feel they've been treated unfairly and or unhappy with the way the complaints have been dealt with by the DWP or organisations deal with benefits, work and financial support. The independent case examiner is an arm of the DWP. It's funded by the DWP and tends to be run by civil servants. And it's a bit of a hook there, or a catch, or a sting in the tail. They can recommend financial redress for maladministration. In other words, if we've messed up, they can recommend that we pay a certain sum of money to both pay for, if like, damages met by the complainant, and also for their time and effort in resolving the issue. Just to sort of say, if you were to look at chapter 19 of the Restart Provider Guidance, those of you running the Restart program, it explains the role of ICE very well. And I think it's quite interesting that one of the things they say is that they act as an independent adjudicator and their role is to support service improvement. I think really the thing with ICE is don't be frightened of them, because they're there to make sure that things are done right. Like, they are the backstop check. And they may charge if we've done things wrong, but hopefully if you've got a good system in place, complaints won't go that far. And if they do, and this is where all the recording comes into place, all the evidence we can supply back to ICE will be used and can be used to demonstrate that we've done everything that we should have done in the right way, and actually gets ICE then on side. It's also really important to keep all your records. ICE might take months to receive or acknowledge a referral. The complainant has up to 6 months to approach ICE with their complaint as well. Again, we sure trust. One of the issues we had is because I had quite a high turnover of staff, is we had complaints that are coming in about a year old. ICE suddenly picked up, where's that come from? And staff have moved on. And in some cases, we didn't have very good records. So it's so important to keep good records at all stages of a complaint. And I'd say too, just something else just to throw in here, particularly if you're front of house facing, and if you are keeping records, perhaps communications or conversations with participants on IT systems, try and keep those comments as unemotive as possible, because sometimes we read some things that actually made us really cringe about what individuals said about participants. And again, it's one of these things where you can say something, when you write it down without the context, it looks awful. So just something to mention there. In terms of the financial redress for maladministration, the Restart program, I think it mentioned a £5,000 contribution to costs that can be recovered. So that's sort of sums of money we're talking about in terms of their, I wasn't going to say fine, but when I spoke to ICE, they said this is just a contribution or a recommendation, suggestion. But that sort of figure is the sort of thing to have in mind, plus obviously any redress to the individual. Just something to throw in about ICE as well, they will only respond to complaints after a local determination has taken place, so they won't jump in early, and also only respond to the actual complaint itself. If anything new gets thrown in, you've got the absolute right to throw it back to ICE and say that wasn't part of the original complaint. Now with ICE 2, there's no right of appeal against what ICE says, but a complainant can actually ask an MP to take the case to the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman. So that's just a little bit about ICE, but I would recommend you read chapter 19 of the provider guidance for the Restart programme, and also have a look at the DWP ICE website as well. There's some information there that you can look at. Learning, well, ICE is a legitimate and necessary escalation route, but its aim is to determine whether maladministration has taken place. And again, importantly, that we want to make sure we have really good records, and those records are unemotive and effectual. So your takeaway then is try and learn a bit more about ICE, read that chapter 19 and look at their website. And maybe even one of the things, again, we did with Sure Trust, we actually invited representatives from the DWP to come to team meetings. They actually really appreciated that, because sometimes they wonder what providers do and what they're getting up to, and it gives an insight to them as well. And maybe we can actually invite someone from ICE to come along to a meeting as well. So looking at our learning, really, I'm sort of trying to roll all this together. What have you learned? Well, all feedback, every bit of feedback we get is useful feedback. The feedback we get might not be complimentary, it might not be kind, but it's useful. And it's really an opportunity to see how our organisation, how our behaviours affect others. Something that's really important is that's all, but everyone is a customer, including the DWP, those who pay our wages as well. That all those stakeholders, they have a right to understand what the organisation's up to, and also have a right to complain. And I can't stress this enough, capture all feedback. Make sure that everything is captured. Ask for it. One can go overboard. I don't know about you, but I get really fed up when you phone a company up and you get a little recorded message saying, or can you hold the line and answer this satisfaction survey? It's frustrating. Not think of those sorts of things, but think of some proactive and structured way of capturing feedback, as well as receiving the voluntary feedback, because that's what's going to give you a really rich picture of what your stakeholders think about you. Implement a feedback management regime. We can't stress that enough, how important it is to have a workable and working feedback management regime to pick up all of this feedback and to deal with it appropriately. And how important it is to keep good records. We don't know, use of vernacular, when something's going to bite us in the bum. That may have happened months ago. If we've got good records, we've got nothing to fear, because we've got a complete audit trail of everything that's happened. And importantly, use our feedback to drive improvement. Continuous improvement is so important to every organisation. We don't want to be an organisation that is stuck in the 20th century when we're in the 21st century, simply because you stuck a head in the sand and haven't bothered to consider the feedback and think about how people think of us. It's so important that we do that. So really, those are the key learning points for today's session. So, final slide is the one you always get at the end of a PowerPoint, open forum, questions and answers. So any thoughts you have, please feel free to share. If you have questions, I'm happy to take them. Can't promise I can answer them. And if you've got complaints, if you'd like to write to be care of my agent in Buenos Aires, that'd be fine. So back to you, Helen, and everyone else in the room.
Okay, fantastic. So I have had a comment from Michelle saying, sorry, I know Mike covered it, but can he recap and discuss the customer complaints process in terms of step-by-step to reporting a complaint, to who and when?
Right, okay, so is this the my stages?
I believe so, yes, that's what I'm thinking.
Okay, so just to recap, stage 0, actually I wonder if I can go back to the, no, right. Stage 0 is really what I'm calling the initial response. If you're the advisor, the person at the front desk, then that's where that comes in, and that's the one that we really need to get right. And that's where we get the complainant coming in, we listen to what they say, we're unemotive, and then we try to take that complaint forward, either by investigating ourselves, finding someone else to investigate, and making an appropriate response. Stage 1 is like an escalation point where the complaint may either bypass front of house or come straight into a complaints department, or could be escalated upwards. And that's where it's handled by an independent complaints review, individual, panel, team, depends what you have in your organisation. And then you've got stage 2, which is where the complaint may be escalated because it's gone further up the line. That's where senior management look at it. So really what you've got is an opportunity here for the complaint to be looked at by those at the front end, the sharp end of the organisation, someone independent, and then someone from senior management. At all times, though, the complaint is overseen by that independent party. Does that help?
Hopefully, yes, it seemed like it works. So we've had a message saying fantastic session, but need to go. So an apology for that. Gillian says, thanks, Mike. Really enjoyed this session, and thanks to Helen too. Oh, you're very welcome, Gillian. Yeah, has to go. It's getting towards the end of the hour. That's fine, that happens, and I think it's been really useful. I know for myself it was really useful to see that slide with the different processes on, and I think it's very much, it's like you say, isn't it, it's having that stage process in place that you can go back to give you confidence that everything's being followed. I'm just waiting if anyone
it's really important too that that process is shared throughout the whole organisation, so everyone in the organisation knows it's there and knows that it works. They're not flying blind.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well. And I think one of the things sort of for me and sort of focusing on how we might feel when feedback comes in, especially feedback maybe that we've done something possibly not right, and it can be quite difficult to hear, can't it? And I know for me, sort of employing the sort of 1% rule has always been important. So even when I receive feedback, that my initial response, as you were talking about the responses earlier, your initial response is to reject that feedback.
Absolutely.
Having the courage to reflect and say, okay, so if 1% of it's true, what's that telling me about how I approached that? So for example, that email, did I make sure that email sounded friendly and, you know, or could it have been misinterpreted? What could I have done differently?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the whole what is my granny test is a really useful test, just to make sure that everyone, or the person, sorry, I've got an alarm go off behind me, that the individual who's making the complaint is treated as a human being. Yes.
It's really, really important, isn't it? Definitely important. I think we've had all of the questions we're going to have at this stage, Mike. So thank you very, very much for that.
Thank you.
Darlene says, thank you, Mike. This session was, of course, it's scrolled up now because I've got a few on there. Thank you, Mike. This session was very helpful. Thanks, Helen, and glad to hear the move went well. Oh, thank you, Darlene. Yes. Mike, I have lots of regulars. They've been through my move with me, which yeah, took a while, but I'm by the seaside now, so I'm very lucky, very lucky.
Ah, excellent, excellent.
Says, thanks, great advice, and thank you so much, as does Leslie. Robert's asked something that I was going to allude to. He said, Mike, are you going to play us out? And I'm assuming he means with one of the guitars that are behind you.
Right, actually, that's my brother-in-law. He's a musician, and I'm staying here, so I'm not actually at home at the moment. So he's a musician. Actually, he and my sister were having a bit of a jam earlier on, but he's told me not to touch the guitars. We've got 2,000 quid worth of guitars in here. So
do not touch anything. Yeah, well, we often talk, don't we, about the background for rooms for Zooms. I've got my Rocky print behind me, my motivational Rocky print, and you've picked a really good venue there.
So if anyone lives in the little Oakley area of Essex, I think they're doing a gig at the old Cherry Tree in a couple of weeks' time.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Right. So yeah, if anyone does, let us know how you found it. So thank you everyone joining us on this sunny Wednesday lunchtime. So thank you very much to Mike. I know we have some more Meraki Consult sessions coming up over the next few weeks. Next week we have Practice Labs joining us, and they'll be looking at how we improve the odds for our customers through essential digital skills. So again, a really useful session for practitioners to come along to and look at what is out there that can help us get better outcomes for our customers. And then the following week, the 4th of August, we have the Good Employability Company. David Imber, one of our fellows, will be joining us again, and he's going to be looking at measuring quality and instilling quality. Those of you who have joined us for David's sessions before will know they're always really engaging and they always throw up some surprises. So please do make sure you join us from that. So in the meantime, from me, Louise, thank you. I've just seen your comment, useful session. Wonderful to have you here, and thank you for that. Everyone, enjoy this wonderful weather we're having at the moment. I know it does feel hot, but yes, let's treasure this summer while we can, and I hope you all have a fantastic week. Take care, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording now, and I will see you all very, very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.